If he didn't create us to fill up what was lacking in him, then he must have created us to receive what was already filled up in him. This is the Extreme Stewardship Podcast, where we explore anything and everything that gets us better at making things good and good at making things better. Right now, I'm trying to get better at understanding and executing on my commander's intent, which means I want to know what the mission is, why the mission is, and what the broad parameters are for how I'm going to get it done. Now, the concept of the commander's intent, at least where I first heard about it, comes from a story that Jocko Willink tells about a mission brief where a group of high-ranking officers is getting briefed on a mission, and the slide deck for this briefing just goes on and on and on, and then finally on slide 150, there's a simple explanation of what the mission is and why they're going to do it. And one of the generals in the room comes up to the briefing officer afterwards and says, next time, delete the first 149 slides and just give us the last one. That last slide was all that mattered, what the mission is and why we're doing it. That last slide was the commander's intent. Now, this episode is about the why. Why is loving God and loving neighbor the one non-negotiable, central, critical, fundamental thing? This is the most fundamental thing, the ultimate reason for the mission that gets all the way to the bottom of the commander's intent. Now, most churches have a doctrinal statement. Every Christian church includes in its doctrinal statement the same basic verbiage about what Christians call the doctrine of the Trinity. Let me say that again. Every Christian church believes the same basic things about the Trinity. Believing those basic things about the Trinity is what makes a church Christian. If your church doesn't affirm those things, it's not a Christian church. Great. What in the world does that have to do with the commander's intent? The commander's intent is the why. It's the reason for the mission. In the last episode, I talked about the mission. Love God, love neighbor. That's the mission. But now we need the reason for the mission. And believe it or not, the reason for the mission, the very heart of the commander's intent, is right there in that piece of your church's doctrinal statement that you've always been vaguely aware of but never paid much attention to, the doctrine of the Trinity. A quick pause. Some of you have read a book called Delighting in the Trinity by Michael Reeves. If you've read that book and wrestled with it, this episode is going to sound familiar. If you don't know Reeves, I hope this episode gets you sufficiently fired up about the doctrine of the Trinity that you go read his book. See the show notes for details. Your church's doctrinal statement says something like this. There is one God, eternally existing as three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And those three persons are equal in power, equal in glory, and they, individually and collectively, are the one God. And if you're not a church history buff or a theology nerd, this sounds really unlike useful information. Now, maybe you've got something in the back of your head that tells you that if Jesus the Son wasn't God, that would somehow mess up our salvation that happened on the cross. True. Or maybe you can see how the Spirit not being God would be weird because then God would have sent us someone else's Spirit and not his. Also true. But if you can spare a few more minutes, I hope I can show you how there's a lot more going on than that. The biblical argument for the doctrine of the Trinity starts like this. Premise 1, there's only one God, because that's like the most obvious thing about the whole biblical story. Every other ancient culture is polytheist. Israel is supposed to be monotheist. All the other so-called gods are demons or rocks or figments of your imagination. One God, monotheism. Premise 2, that one God is the Father of Jesus. Jesus said this 100 times, and also the Father said this on a couple of occasions, like Jesus' baptism and transfiguration. Premise 3, Jesus himself is also that one God. This is where it gets weird. There are dozens of places in the gospel stories where Jesus will say, whether in word or through actions, that he is the God of Israel. He is the one who parted the waters. He is the one who blew up Mount Sinai. He, Jesus, is the one who created everything in the first place. Premise 4, Jesus is not his Father. Well, duh. But it matters, actually, that Jesus and the Father are not two different stage presences belonging to one actor. They talk to each other. They talk about each other. They partner with each other. So they can't be the same person exactly, even though, don't forget premise one, there's still only one God. Now, conclusion thus far, the Father and the Son are both the one God, but they're different from each other in some way we don't yet understand. And we could basically rerun premises 2 through 4 with respect to the Spirit and get back to this point and say the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are each the one God, but they're different from each other in some way we don't yet understand. Insert the word person to cover that distinction we don't quite understand, and now we have your church's doctrinal statement. One God, three persons. And unfortunately, we often stop there. One God, three persons, the Mormons lose, we win, moving on. Makes us feel better about our church's doctrinal statement, but doesn't do anything. So this is the pivotal moment. This is the moment where we stop thinking of the doctrine of the Trinity as an apologetic for why cults are bad and start thinking of it as the foundation for everything. So here's how the Trinity is the foundation for everything, starting with the whole point of this podcast episode, the commander's intent. Okay? Pay attention to this because this is the real thing right here. God created everything. Before he created everything, there wasn't anything else except for him. And yet, before he created anything else, before there was anything else, he wasn't lonely. He wasn't bored. He wasn't unfulfilled. He wasn't lacking in any way at all, no exceptions. Well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because God himself is Father, Son, and Spirit. And I know it sounds weird, but they are not lonely or bored because they have each other. One God, don't forget that. One God, but three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. And they're good to go without you, without me, without anything else. So now ask this question. Why did God, Father, Son, and Spirit, that God, why did God create us? Why did he create anything at all? Well, start with the wrong answer, because he needed to. He needed us to fill something up that was lacking in him. Now, that's the wrong answer because he's not lacking anything. He's not lacking relationship. He's not lacking stimulation. He's not lacking glory. He's not lacking any of these things because he has all of them in himself as Father, Son, and Spirit. Now, one of my favorite podcasters is a guy named Daryl Cooper. He does some superb deep dives into historical stuff, everything from Israel-Palestine to West Virginia coal mining. And he's got this great series on Jim Jones. If you don't know who Jim Jones is, you've probably heard the phrase, drink the Kool-Aid. Jim Jones was the cult leader of the People's Temple. That's the group that went down to Guyana and ended up committing mass suicide by drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. Daryl Cooper's got this great series on that whole story. And at one point, it's in his podcast called Martyr Made. It's episode 15 of the podcast, episode 5 of that series. It's called The Wounded King. And Cooper goes on this explanatory tangent about Jim Jones as a classic narcissist. So to explain how narcissism works, he goes back into an old comic book series called The Purple Man. The Purple Man is the anti-hero. He's a guy who can make anyone do absolutely anything he wants them to do. He tells you to go jump off a roof, you go jump off a roof. He tells you to kill your best friend, you kill your best friend. But then the Purple Man encounters the protagonist, Jessica Jones. And for reasons I don't recall, Jessica Jones can resist the Purple Man. She doesn't have to do whatever he wants her to do. And the Purple Man becomes obsessed with Jessica Jones, with getting her to do what he wants her to do. Now, and the point with respect to narcissism is that a narcissist like Jim Jones has the ability to manipulate people into doing pretty much whatever he wants them to do. For real. Like all the way to the point of selling their stuff, moving from California to Guyana, and killing themselves. So he's good at this. But he knows what he's doing. He knows these people didn't choose him. He manipulated them. He controlled them. It wasn't their decision. And because he's a narcissist, he desperately needs the free approval of others. But because he's a narcissist, the only thing he knows how to do is force it or manipulate it out of them. So the one thing he needs which is for people to willingly approve of him without him manipulating them into it, that's the one thing he can't have. That's the endless cycle of a successful narcissist. Now, back to the comic book, the Purple Man comes across someone he can't manipulate, and he realizes that the one thing he really wants in the world is for that person to be on his side. That would fill his love tank because it would be real, it would be free. But because Jessica Jones sees him for who he really is, she's not going to be on his side. Likewise, Jim Jones, okay, except Jim Jones isn't quite as powerful, so he's not always sure whether people are with him freely or not, so he's constantly devising tests of obedience. Let me make sure you're really with me. Go sell your house and give me the money. I need some confirmation you're on our side. Give up control of your kids. That sort of thing. Now, I found this an incredibly insightful way of looking at Jim Jones and narcissists in general. But then Cooper, the podcaster, goes on a secondary tangent, a tangent within the tangent, and starts talking about the God of the Old Testament. How God is this all-powerful being who can make people do whatever he wants them to do. But what he really wants is for someone to choose him. But he can't help himself. He forces some people to choose him, and he fries everyone else. So the one thing he wants, he doesn't have. And Cooper maps this view of God onto the story of Abraham and Isaac. God desperately needs Abraham to be willing to sacrifice Isaac because that would communicate to God that Abraham really does love him without being forced or manipulated into it. A test of obedience, just like Jim Jones would provide at the People's Temple. And then Cooper goes to Job, same thing. But Job, even while passing the test, names the test for what it is and stands up to God. And eventually, God backs down at least a little bit and says, "You're right, Job. You really didn't do anything wrong. My bad. You win." But God also gets what he wants, which is someone who will pass that arbitrary and horrific test of obedience and prove that they really do worship him without being forced to. Now, for the sorts of people who listen to this podcast, Cooper's take on the God of the Bible might be rather offensive. Or maybe you just shrug it off and think, well, that's not the God I know. Don't be too quick to dismiss what he's saying. Because if you're an honest person, an honest reader of the Bible, it's not obvious what's going on in the book of Job. It's not obvious how God testing Abraham by asking him to murder his own son fits the God we think we know. Remember, knowing the commander's intent means going out of our way to make sure that we don't filter out all the things that don't make sense by fixating on the things we think do make sense. So pause and hear the plausibility of someone coming to the Bible and reading these stories and many others and thinking the God of Jim Jones, or should I say the God Jim Jones thought he was, isn't so different from the God of the Bible. Daryl Cooper is not crazy, but Daryl Cooper is missing something. And the something that he's missing is the notion that God had anything to gain by creating us in the first place. It's the biggest why question. Why did God let there be anything besides himself at all? And the answer isn't, the answer can't be, because he was missing something. He was lonely. He was unfulfilled. I mentioned Michael Reeves' book, Delighting in the Trinity, and this is where he makes the critical point. A single person deity, says Reeves, creates out of need. He's missing something. He needs something from his creatures that he didn't have before, which is either slaves or meaningful free relationships. Either way, we complete him. But that's an awkward situation for an all-powerful being, because either he forces his creatures to love him or he doesn't. And if he doesn't force them to love him and they don't choose to love him, now he's got creatures sitting there who aren't giving him the one thing he created them to give him. And since he's never done this whole relationship thing before and he's all powerful, well, he really is the Purple Man. If the God of the Bible is what Reeves calls a single person deity, the God of Job is a pretty scary fellow. But what if God isn't a single person deity? What if he's Father, Son, and Spirit? If he's Father, Son, and Spirit, he's not lonely. He's not bored. He's not incomplete. He's not relationally stunted. When he creates everything, when he creates us, it's not because we offer him something he didn't already have that he's just been doing without for all eternity. There's got to be some other purpose behind all this. And if he didn't create us to fill up what was lacking in him, then he must have created us to receive what was already filled up in him. So what was already filled up in him? What was already there, always full, ready to overflow from God to us? Well, that's going to be a function of the relational dynamic between Father, Son, and Spirit. Because whatever he already was, that's what we're going to get. And if we look for places in the Bible that talk about the relationship between Father and Son, for example, how that relationship worked before creation, we're going to keep finding the word love. God is love, says 1 John 4, verse 8, which has to mean he was love before you and I showed up, which has to mean he knew how to love and did actually love before he created everything. And if we dig one layer deeper, we'd find John 17, verse 24, where Jesus says, "You, Father, loved me, Son, before the creation of the world." Before there was anything else, the fundamental thing happening between Father, Son, and Spirit, apart from and prior to you and I coming on the scene, is love. Love isn't something he had to learn how to do after he made us. Giving love isn't the missing piece of the puzzle for him. He's not hopelessly entangled in the self-defeating prison of narcissism the way an all-powerful single-person creator would be if receiving love were his end game. Now, I hope this prompts a whole bunch of deeper questions about how that works and what it's like to be God as Father, Son, and Spirit, and what it means for the Father to love the Son and the Son to love the Father. And I hope you'll forgive me for not going into all that on this podcast. If that's your jam, email me and I'll give you some book recommendations and invite you to take a systematic theology class with me sometime. The point here is simply this. If that line in your church's doctrinal statement that you've always known about but never paid attention to, that line about God being one God, three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, if that's not true, God is indeed an all-powerful narcissist. He wants love. He needs love. He'll do anything to get love, so watch out. But if he is Father, Son, and Spirit, and therefore doesn't actually need anything from you, if he created you precisely so that he could give you something, and the only thing there is to give you is himself, and to give you himself is to invite you into the love that he already has in himself, well, that's a rather different take on the meaning of life, isn't it? It's probably a different take on that bit of your church's doctrinal statement, too. Now, finding the commander's intent is all about the why behind the what. The what is to love. Why? Because that's what God is. Father, Son, and Spirit, always three, always one, always love. And that's why he made us. That's why we exist. To receive his love and to overflow his love. That is our commander's intent. Thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. My behind-the-scenes partner in this project is my brother, Ben Kibbe. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Leah Leanhoutz, and of course, music is provided by Dave Murray of Daradoon Guitars. If this series has been helpful or challenging to you, or if you've got a story about extreme stewardship that you'd be willing to share, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. You are, of course, welcome to like and subscribe and tell your friends and all that. What we really care about is that you have gotten better at making things good and good at making things better.